let's go over the model of supply and demand and see how international trade plays into that. You may recall that a country has a comparative advantage in producing a good or service if their opportunity cost for producing this good or service is lower than for other countries. So countries that specialize in one good and trade for another good with another country can end up consuming more. When a country's opportunity cost of producing a good or service is lower than for other countries, it means that this country has a comparative advantage in producing this good or service. Autarky is a situation in which a country cannot trade with other countries, so it fully depends on itself. Open economy is a situation when a country can trade freely with other countries. We'll go over a hypothetical figure for production possibility frontiers from the United States and Mexico. We'll assume that there are only two countries, only two goods, and that the production possibility frontiers are straight lines. Suppose both countries only produce airplanes or auto parts. So quantity of airplanes is now the y-axis and quantity of auto parts is the x-axis. Suppose both countries are in autarky. They don't trade with each other. So they can only consume what they produce. So that means for the US, that is panel A here, it can produce 2,000 airplanes and 0 auto parts, or 1,000 auto parts and 0 airplanes, or something in between. So remember that anything along this production possibility frontier is feasible and efficient. So let's say they can pick this point C where they produce 1,000 airplanes and 500 auto parts. Panel B shows Mexico's production possibility frontier. Again, Mexico's in autarky, so they only can consume what they produce. So that would be either 1,000 airplanes and 0 auto parts, or 2,000 auto parts and 0 airplanes, or something, or some combination of both. For example, 500 airplanes and 1,000 auto parts. The US production and consumption in autarky, the slope here is -2, which is a rise over run. Mexico's production and consumption in autarky, the slope is -0.5. And to calculate the slope that is constant along this line, for the US, we just pick 2 points, calculate the difference in y over difference in x. If we pick this point here and this point here, when we go from 2,000 airplanes to 0, that would be -2,000. And change in x would be going from 0 auto parts to 1,000. So it's plus 1,000. That is why the slope is -2. And for Mexico, it's the same thing, rise over run, or change in y over change in x. Again, we pick 2 points, this one and this one, and we have a change in y from one point to the other is -1,000. Change in x is 2,000. So that is why it's -0.5. Remember that the slope of the production possibility frontier is the same as the opportunity cost. So for the US, in order to produce one bundle of auto parts, it has to give up 2 airplanes. That's the -2, the opportunity cost. For Mexico, in order to produce one bundle of auto parts, it has to give up half an airplane, so much less. So that means it has a comparative advantage in producing auto parts because it has a lower opportunity cost for producing auto parts. So probably that means that Mexico should specialize in auto parts. To produce one airplane, US has to give up a half bundle of auto parts, whereas Mexico has to give up 2 bundles of auto parts. The lower opportunity cost wins because the lower opportunity cost of producing one airplane is in the US, that means that the US should probably specialize in producing airplanes in this example. So this Ricardian model of international trade shows that trade between two countries makes both countries better off than they would be in autarky. So there are gains from trade. So if we write out production and consumption under autarky, we can see that the United States will produce 500 auto parts bundles, and that means that it can only consume 500. It cannot consume more than it produces. It is infeasible to consume more. It can produce and consume 1,000 airplanes. At the same time, Mexico will produce and consume 1,000 auto part bundles and 500 airplanes. And altogether, if we put these together, we'll have the total 1,500 auto parts and 1,500 airplanes, both produced and consumed. Now, what happens if both countries trade? To know what happens, we have to go back to our production possibility frontier. Remember that if the US specializes in airplanes and produces airplanes only, that means it will be over here. So it can produce 2,000 airplanes and 0 auto parts. If Mexico specializes in auto parts and will only produce auto parts, it can produce 2,000 bundles of auto parts. We should remember that when we look at the table below. So if the US specializes and produces only airplanes, it will be able to produce 2,000 airplanes, and Mexico will be able to produce 2,000 auto part bundles. So that means that the US can trade and can consume both auto parts and airplanes if it trades, and the same for Mexico. It can trade and consume both. So how much would they produce and consume altogether? Remember that it used to be 1,500 auto part bundles and 1,500 airplanes. Well, when they specialize in trade, it becomes 2,000 auto part bundles and 2,000 airplanes. So that has tremendously increased the production and consumption of auto parts and airplanes. So the gains from the international trade are as follows. In autarky, the US consumption cannot be anywhere beyond this line. So it will choose, let's say, this point C, at which it consumes 1,000 airplanes and 500 auto parts. But with trade, its production becomes 2,000 airplanes, and its consumption now becomes this point that was infeasible before because it is located outside the production possibility frontier. So now the US consumption with trade has achieved something that was infeasible in autarky. What about Mexico? Mexico production and consumption in autarky was somewhere on this line, which is, let's say, 500 airplanes and 1,000 auto part bundles. If they decide to trade, they will produce 2,000 auto part bundles. So how much will they consume? Now they'll consume at this point that was infeasible when Mexico was in autarky. So now both countries are gaining from trade and specialization. In fact, if we compare autarky and trade, we see that both countries have gained from trade. Now let's look at the supply and demand model and how international trade fits into it. We'll have here a domestic demand curve, that is the quantity of goods demanded by residents of a country, and the domestic supply curve, that shows how goods supplied by producers depends on the price of that good. We'll also have the world price of a good, at which the good can be bought or sold abroad. When a market is open to trade, competition among importers or exporters will drive the domestic price to equality with the world price. If the world price is lower than the autarky price, the trade will lead to imports and a fall in the domestic price compared with the world price. There will be overall gains from trade because consumer gains will exceed the producer losses. Remember that the consumer surplus is the economic measure of consumer satisfaction from the price. Graphically, it is the area under the demand curve and above the price. The producer surplus is the economic measure of the producer's satisfaction with the price. On a graph, it will be the area above the supply curve and below the price. So here's an example of consumer surplus and producer surplus when the price is PA. PA just means we're in autarky, price in autarky, and QA is quantity in autarky. Here we see the market that is in equilibrium, where the price is driven by the equilibrium, and so we have consumer surplus and producer surplus that are maximized under these conditions. What happens when the economy opens and the world price is actually lower than the autarky price? The price will now be driven down to be equal to the world price. Domestic producers will want to supply less of a good at this new lower price. But at the same time, if we go to the intersection of the price and the domestic demand, which is right here, we'll see that the domestic demand is higher because at this lower price, consumers want more of the product. This part here is how much of this product is supplied domestically at this new world price. And this part here is how much imports are being supplied from producers abroad to satisfy the domestic demand. So let's write this out. In autarky, price is PA, and quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, and it is equal to QA. With trade, price becomes PW. Quantity demanded is QD, which is higher than QA. Quantity supplied domestically is QS. And then the imports will be equal to the difference between QD and QS. Let's go over this again. Here's the market for auto parts. The autarky price is PA, but it goes down when the economy opens to trade, and it is now equal to world price PW. At this world price, to understand how much is actually traded, how much is actually demanded, we have to look at the intersection between the price and the domestic supply, price and the domestic demand. The intersection between price and the domestic demand is the quantity demanded domestically. The intersection of the price line and the domestic supply is how much will be supplied domestically. The rest, QD minus QS, or this length here, is imports. So how do imports affect surplus? In autarky, consumer surplus was just equal to area W. With trade, consumer surplus is equal to W plus X plus Z. So the new gain is X plus Z. Producer surplus in autarky was the area X plus Y. Now, with trade, producer surplus is just the area Y, so we just lost X. But this X was actually recovered by consumer surplus right here. So really, the change in total surplus is positive because we gained area Z. So total surplus in autarky was area W plus X plus Y, and total surplus now is W plus X plus Y plus Z. So we gained this new area here as a society. So even though the producers lost, the consumers actually gained that surplus plus more. What about the effects of exports on the trade? Suppose the world price is higher than autarky price. That means it is lucrative for the country to export their good. There will be exports and a rise in the domestic price compared with the world price. And there will be still overall gains from trade because producer gains will exceed consumer losses from this higher world price. So here we have a domestic market with exports. How do we know we have exports here? We start with autarky price, PA. And A is our point of equilibrium. And so at this point, both the quantity supplied and quantity demanded is QA. When the country opens to trade, they witness that the price outside the world price is higher, and so their price now becomes PW. At this new higher price, consumers are less willing to buy the product, but the producers are more willing to sell the product. If we're talking about the price PW, now we need to understand what is quantity supplied and demanded at this price. For that, we have to look at the intersection of the price line with the domestic demand, which is this point B here, that dictates quantity demanded. And the intersection of the price line with the domestic supply is point C, which dictates quantity supplied, which is QS. And with trade, there's more quantity supplied than quantity demanded. So this distance here represents the exports, QS minus QD. How do exports affect surplus? In autarky, consumer surplus was equal to the area W and X. And with trade, consumer surplus is now smaller. It's just the area W. What about producer surplus? In autarky, producer surplus was area Y. But with trade now, producer surplus is the area Y plus X plus Z. So consumer surplus lost X, but it was gained by producer surplus, and also producer surplus gained area Z. Total surplus, which is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, used to be X plus W plus Y, and now it is that area plus Z. So this area of the triangle Z is something that was not a part of the society welfare before, but it is now. Let's go over an example. Find consumer and producer surplus in autarky and with trade. A, if the world price is 20. In autarky, the price is 40. That is defined by this equilibrium point here. And so the quantity is 2. And so to find consumer surplus, we need to calculate this area here. It's area ABE. So that is the area of the right triangle, which is 70 minus 40 times 2 minus 0 divided by 2 equal 30. Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So it's this area CDF that we need to find. It's also the area of the right triangle, so it is 40 minus 10 times 2 minus 0 divided by 2. It's also 30. So the total surplus is the consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is equal to 60. The world price of $20 is lower than equilibrium, so it will be more lucrative for the country to import the polo shirts. Let's look at the consumer surplus and producer surplus at price of 20. Consumer surplus, remember, that is the area above the price line and below the demand curve. So it is this big triangle now. So it is height times base divided by 2, 70 minus 20, times 3 minus 0 divided by 2. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve but below the price. So it's this little area D now. Producer surplus is now 20 minus 10 times 1 divided by 2. It's 5. So the total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is 75 plus 5, which is 80. In fact, this shaded area is what was gained by the consumers in addition to the previous total surplus. Now let's imagine that the price in the world is $60. Price of $60 means that it is higher than the equilibrium price of 40, which means that the country will now open to exports. At this price of $60, we have the consumer surplus that is quite small. It's just equal to area A. That's because consumers are not really excited to buy the product at this high price. So it is 70 minus 60 times 1 minus 0 divided by 2 equal to 5. Producer surplus is now much higher. So it's the area below the price above the supply curve. There's this large triangle here. And this area is 60 minus 10 times 3 minus 0 divided by 2, which is equal to 75. Finally, the total surplus is the sum of consumer and producer surplus, which is 80. And so this shaded area is now what was gained by the producers in addition to all the previous surplus that is still in the society. Of course, this model that we just went over means that the economy is open and so the country can trade as it wishes. However, a lot of countries have trade protection. Many countries establish policies that limit imports. And the most common policies include tariffs and import quotas. A tariff is essentially a tax on imports, which raises the domestic price above the world price, and it leads to a fall in imports. An import quota is a limit on the quantity of a good that can be imported. Its effect is like that of a tariff, except the revenues or the quota rents accrue to the license holder, not to the government. We will talk about the trade protection in the next video.